Why sailing? What led you to sailing?
Well, you need luck in life, I think. And one of our pieces of luck, my brother and I, would we grew up in a suburb called Chelsea, outside of Melbourne, in Victoria, and we climb over the back fence of our house, and we're on the beach at Chelsea on Port Phillip Bay, and just a little bit long along the from where we had a boat shed, as it turns out, about half a k was the Chelsea Yacht Club. So summer times we'd muck around with boats, and winter time we'd play footy and try and do some schoolwork in between. So our upbringing, my brother and I, with mum and dad had no interest in sailing, but they had interest in us to back us as much as they could. We had no money. Like when Dad died, and I was 15, then we had not enough money for the funeral, so it was the reality of the situation. However, uh, looking back on it, the support that I received, and then when Dad died, just from Mum, and just remarkable. Yeah.
So, is that something that any young person today could aspire to?
Well, absolutely. That you can get into the sport of sailing very, very easily and cheaply, and get into the learn to sail programs around the country. Big revolution in the sport in terms of they used to be inward looking, big walls around these yacht clubs. It's hard to figure out how to get in. It was kind of intimidating. Well, of course, with the competition of sport anyway in this country, all these yacht clubs have opened their doors and they have learned to sail programs, which are very, very good.
How does the 1983 victory feel 40 years on when you look back at it?
Well, I think, 40 years is a long time ago. Uh, but I kind of I get reminded literally every day by someone in a street, not telling me what I was doing, but what they were doing when we crossed the finishing line. Now, younger generations, of course, they had no experience in that space, but people who are old enough to remember, and it's part of the culture of this country. The America's Cup and Bob Hawke. Anyone who fires anyone for being late today for work is a bum. For God's sake, that's the Prime Minister of Australia.
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't
It's
it?
extraordinary. Broadcasting to the world.
Yeah.
The Americans and the Brits and the Germans, they shaking their heads. Who is this guy?
And putting on that wonderful jacket.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And typical of Bob, and I got to know him reasonably well. He, with his communication, he stole the moment. He seized the moment. None of that was rehearsed. I know that for a fact, and it just literally came out of them. It's just that's who he was. It was a man of the people, and I look back on it also, and why was it such a big deal? Because it was apparently we're halfway around the world when we did our thing, but apparently the celebrations were not unlike the end of World War II. So why was it such a big deal? I think one of it is, we're talking about September 1983. So this country had gone through tough bushfires, floods, recession. It was a global recession, and Australia was doing it pretty tough. Our backs were to the wall, and here we came from 3-1 down, like it was the Anzac fighting spirit of backs to the wall, back from the dead, you might say, and we're able to beat the United States of America. And except for the Olympic Games, we don't really take on the US very often, and here it was doing something that no nation had achieved since before the US Civil War, which was when the America's Cup started and the Americans first won it.
Let's move on to some of the technology. How important was the technology for you to win that race?
Big deal. You had to, like Formula One motor racing. You may have the best drivers or best pit team in the world, but if the technology is not up there, so you can't play the game, then it's a pointless exercise. So, the reality is the technology had to be world class, and the wing keel and Ben Lexon was fundamental to that.
You describe Ben Lexon as the Da Vinci of Australia. What was it like to work with him?
To put it in context, he went to school at 9 and left at 12. So he had 3 years of formal education, which, for goodness sake, nothing. But he was basically an orphan. He grew up, different people. And so he was never taught to think inside a box. And working with someone like Ben was just a totally different aberration to that, because he would study the flight of birds, and he'd be totally locked in with with Mother Nature, and he was an observer of life, an observer of nature. And to work with a man like that, the man was brilliant, with no restrictions. Now to put that into a project where you had to deliver a project on time, on budget, was pretty, it was quite an exercise with Ben. But we got there, and the wing keel was all part and parcel of that, that freedom of expression that he had.
Let's talk a little bit about leadership. You won 47 of those 55 races. How would you describe your leadership style? What does leadership mean to you?
I think, fundamentally it's empowering people, endeavoring to get the best people in the world within an organization, if that's possible, and to, give them direction and give them a vision and let them go for it. So the vision of that particular, of the Australia to America's Cup Challenge this was way back in 1983. Let's endeavour to understand what the game will look like in the year 2000. Okay, so we're talking about 1983. What will the game look like in the year 2000? Let's get there faster than anyone else in the world.
So when someone like that comes to you with this outside the box idea that instinctively looks not like anything you've ever seen, how do you go ahead? How do you make the call to go ahead or not to go ahead with it?
Interesting enough, initially the boat Australia 2 was slower than the conventional boat, but with a lot of changes to the sail shape developments and spinnakers and the position of the keel, we were able to get the boat up to become pretty competitive. And then we had this tacking ability, which was a breakthrough from a match racing point of view.
How important was the whole psychology component in how you led the team and also how you beat the Americans?
Our win-loss ratio against the other foreign challengers, because we had to beat the Canadians, the French, and the Brits and so on, Italians, it was pretty good. I think we won 47 of the 56 races over 5 months of competition before we won the right to actually challenge for the America's Cup. And the Americans didn't know what they were racing against because we kept the keel secret. So when we started to show, very, very strong, ability to play the game at the highest level, the fact that they didn't know what they were racing against became of great concern. And we saw that in hindsight in the final decision-making of the final race, where in hindsight they made more mistakes than we did. But it was pretty close.
You've had this extraordinary sailing legacy, but it sits alongside a substantial additional body of work. There's the work that you've been doing with Swimming Australia. There's the Australian Sport Hall of Fame. I believe there's even environmental activism in that mix.
Well, I'm a patron of the Women's and Youth America's Cup Challenge for Australia. And that you can't ask for any more green energy than that. We just sail boats with Mother Nature wind on foils, as it turns out. And the chase boats are hydrogen powered. Very cool. Yeah, foiling boats going at 50 knots. So, and this is a creation of Team New Zealand, who are the custodians of the America's Cup. So, we're green everywhere and showcasing, what can be done. And these newer foiling America's Cup boats, they're now sailing 5 times the speed of the wind. So in 20 kilometers an hour of wind speed, would you believe that these boats are sailing up to 100 kilometers an hour over the water in 20 kilometers an hour of wind speed?
Are you still sailing?
Yeah, I love it. I race in the estuaries. I love the smell of gunpowder. I love the smell of competition. So I don't race weekends. I find that boring, but I enjoy putting a team together. I've got a young team on the estuaries. We just won the national championships in the estuaries. We've got the world championships, as it turns out, in Fremantle in March next year. So we'll give it a crack.